So China has always had a problem, well, for many years after the opening up and reform period, has had a problem of overcapacity and overproduction. So essentially you would have sectors, state-driven sectors, in which, say, the steel sector and these kinds of sectors would overproduce. They would simply have too much on their hands. And so the Belt and Road Initiative, after the state-owned enterprises started to go global way back in the 1980s, decided, well, this is actually, we need to do something about this problem. So a way in which to mitigate this issue and in which to, there are plenty of other targets that the Belt and Road is also filling, such as handling the, let's say, the shift between one kind of economic model to a different one and all of these kinds of things. So making China more self-sustainable, but also making sure that China gets more integrated into the wider world and make sure that the US can't directly contain it and all of these things, is to take all of this overcapacity and export it elsewhere. And that has been one of the sort of driving things with Belt and Road from the beginning, because it is a mega infrastructure initiative. So this is really one of the interesting things that I believe quite a lot of, let's say, very critical policymaking literature overlooks. From China's side, it's always been about making sure that China's economy stays stable, China's sort of production capacity is taken care of in different places. But of course, there's also the political angle. And you said the transactional nature, and I think this is what we see now the most, probably, because it's true that, there is a very clear, let's say, political motivation behind it, in the sense that China builds all of these things. It makes sure that there are plenty of investments going to other countries, at least this before COVID, but we can get back to that. So it makes sure that all of these things are taken care of, that there's, let's say, a certain incentive for policymakers and politicians in different countries to work with China bilaterally, but also, of course, work with China on the multilateral forums. And China is getting different things out of this. Access to strategic resources, better transshipment, let's say, better access to sea lanes of communication and all of these kinds of things. But of course also political support when China needs it. And as I also mentioned earlier, global China, this phenomenon of China sort of becoming more and more influential on the world stage, also means, as I said, such issues as the China threat theory being developed by academics and the policymakers in Western countries. And China realizes that this is a huge issue. So China is essentially increasingly trying to portray itself as a benevolent power that is out to help other countries. So portraying the Belt and Road Initiative as South-South cooperation and all of these kinds of things, trying to make sure that it shows that developing countries can rely on China as a model to follow, but also as a sort of, as I said, alternative to the US, because the US in many developing countries, very fairly, I think, is usually viewed as a colonizing power more than anything. And China is trying to make it very clear that China is not doing the same kind of thing. It has this non-interference strategy in these
So
things.
I want to just touch on that, because it's interesting you use the words the American model, but it's linked to colonization, and the non-interference that's linked to, I think China has a policy of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, correct? That's the official policy. Now, whether that's actually happening in practice is a different story.
Right.
But I just want to contrast. I mentioned before that in Sri Lanka, especially, there's a Western we're antagonistic towards the West for various reasons, and we tend to mistrust the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe, etc. Using that basis, if you look at, so the basic worry is that the United States and the West are trying to take advantage of Sri Lanka. Then you look at China, they've done all this investment into Sri Lanka, built ports, roads, and infrastructures. But if you look at where Sri Lanka stands today, and this is where it's going to be really interesting for Sri Lankans, is that it's not America that owns a port in Sri Lanka, or it's not America that funded an airport which didn't have planes. It's China, and it's China that, for example, has another 99-year lease on the Colombo port city as well, which is on the doorstep of India. And Sri Lanka exists in what we like to call, or what India thinks is their sphere of influence, right? So having such significant Chinese footprints in Sri Lanka, whilst being in India's sphere of influence presents its own issues.
Right.
But how do you contrast this? And this is not unique to Sri Lanka. There are many projects around the world, Pakistan, I think, Kazakhstan. There's many of these Belt and Road Initiative projects that either have been trimmed down, they've completely stalled, or the Chinese government has basically withdrawn from it. And when you take that and you look at Sri Lanka and this particular view we have of China, is it justified? Because they seem to have taken, you mentioned strategic resources around the world. Now they've clearly got some strategic resources in China. So I'm just putting it to you, sort of a devil's advocate, if I may. Is it true that China's really benign, that it's really transactional? Because it seems like they've got a 99-year lease on a port, they've got a 99-year lease on the port city. Can we really say that Chinese influence is simply transactional? Can we say that?
I think it's an interesting, and I mean, this is also, I have to say, it's a very complex issue, and I don't mean to say that the West is inherently colonizing anyone or that China.
These are all perceptions, right?
Right. And this, especially this, let's say the understanding of China's interests and of China's goals is obviously very much eye of the beholder kind of thing.
Sure.
I mean, will always be, there will always be a lot of different opinions about this. I think generally speaking, it's quite clear to me at least that China has a lot of, I mean, let's say, there are the overt goals with the strategy of the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are the covert goals. And I definitely believe that China has, let's say, to a quite large extent, quite benign intentions when it comes to these things, because it's also important for China to, let's say, build up capacity so that it will become, let's say, the world will become more financially integrated and more goods will be exported from China. And I mean, there are a lot of, like, quite, let's say, I mean, for other countries to do something like this, they would have a similar intention. So that's also what I always try to think about. I mean, with rivaling infrastructure initiatives, usually there are certain things that are expected from the government that they will get out of this, whether it be the G7 Build Back Better World strategy, whether it's the EU Commission Global Gateway strategy, whether it's the Japan strategy, the India strategy. I mean, there are quite a lot of contenders. There are quite a lot of rival infrastructure strategies that would have similar goals. And I think in this respect, we can't blame China, so to speak, for having different motivations, especially when it comes to actually having access to these ports, to having these financial integrations and so on and so forth.
And in a way, hasn't China sort of brought about this trend of massive infrastructure investments from the United States with Build Back Better, with Japan from its better quality infrastructure, and so it's sort of with India as well in our region.
Right.
So it's sort of been a boon for investments, hasn't it? It's sort of because these other major nations that probably not have been interested in investing in our infrastructure now are thinking, well, we better because China's getting in there, we have to compete with them. So in a way, it's sort of driven this infrastructure investment program globally, hasn't it?
It has, and I mean, that is, I think, one of the, let's say, happier takeaways from all of this, right? But it's definitely also true that there have been a lot of issues when it comes to the Belt and Roads implementation in different countries, and there have been a lot of quite contentious things happening.
So